Mikhail Gorbachev said to me at one meeting that his dream was that Ireland could reconcile Moscow and Washington. So Mikhail Gorbachev said that to me in 2010. It's precisely because of our friendship with the Americans, and on the other hand, what he thought was our empathy, where we might be able to understand a Russian perspective better than many others.
Welcome to the Cassandra Voices podcast, an Irish home for independent journalism with a global perspective. The prophetess Cassandra advised her fellow Trojans to reject the horse the Greeks had seemingly left behind as a gift, but was ignored. Our Cassandra Voices podcast offers cautionary tales and inspiring narratives to illuminate our own troubled times. We'll be putting out regular episodes reflecting the broad scope of our magazine's coverage over the last 6 years. Thanks to the Loafing Heroes and especially Bartholomew Ryan for the use of their track Ro Goira from the 2019 album Meander Tales. In a turbulent period in European history and beyond, we are delighted to draw on the sage input of the former Irish ambassador to Russia, Philip McDonagh, who also worked for a long period on the Good Friday Agreement that brought peace to Northern Ireland. He explores the possibilities for a lasting, inclusive peace between Russia and Ukraine. He also laments the expansion of military investment in the UK and elsewhere, calling for a new global vision to contend with the troubles of our time. Welcome to the Cassandra Voices podcast. We are delighted to host Philip McDonagh, who is a career diplomat, a former Irish ambassador to India, the Holy See, Finland, Russia, and the OSCE, as well as being the director of the Centre for Religion, Human Values and International Relations at DCU in Dublin. As well as that, he has published 5 volumes of poetry so far, and his latest volume will be called The Estuary and will be published by Daedalus Press. Welcome, Philip, and thank you for agreeing to discuss the international situation as we find it today. I'd first like to discuss really the role of rhetoric in conflict management and the extent to which sometimes political leaders become prisoners of their own rhetoric. I wonder, would you have any general comments to make on that subject?
Yes, Aristotle states that our human ability to persuade, our capacity for deliberation in community is the basis of politics. And so therefore, at the very beginning of the Western tradition of reflection on politics, the role of rhetoric is front and center. And the key issue is whether rhetoric is used to gradually bring to light elements of truth and understanding, or might it be used in a different way? And in this connection, I think the key concept we have to keep in mind is dissent, a right to dissent. Society is always changing, and unless we protect the awkward voice or the dissenting voice, we won't have democracy or indeed any other workable system of government. I could actually say more about this because I've just been studying some of the relevant Greek texts. I've just been looking at the 3 speeches attributed to Pericles in the history of Thucydides. So these are very influential statements. One of those speeches is regarded as the most important statement about democracy before the Gettysburg Address. But the one that I want to focus on is Pericles' 3rd statement, which is in the 2nd year of the war against Sparta. And in this statement, Pericles makes a number of points which I think Thucydides wants us to see are very questionable. The first is that we, the Athenians, must cultivate contempt for the enemy. And contempt is the word, it's kataphronesis, looking down on them. So Pericles says we must have a sense of our own superiority. And the second thing is that Pericles is very dismissive of anyone within Athens who's not wholly behind the war effort. And he describes those people as basically passengers. And the third point is that he offers an analysis of the situation based on the great resources available to Athens. So it's, if you like, a technocratic analysis. Now, there's a huge dramatic irony in this because, as we all know, Athens lost the Peloponnesian War. Circumstances happened which Pericles had not foreseen, such as the Great Plague in Athens or the increasing involvement of Persia in the war. Pericles had assumed at the beginning that the Persians were not going to be involved. But above all, the quality of politics in Athens itself was affected. There was a ricochet effect. This hard line, this technocratic analysis had a ricochet effect on Athenian society. And so the net effect of this aggressive rhetoric of Pericles was the collapse of Athens through overreach and, well, the Greek word would be hubris, and the discrediting of democracy for how many, more than 2,000 years, until maybe the late 18th or 19th century. So right at the beginning of the Western tradition, we have this wonderfully framed examination of the role of rhetoric. And as I say, the key lesson is one must allow for dissent, and one must allow for what the British called in the 19th century a loyal opposition. You can't think about the future other than through words and language, and other than with the presence of the awkward dissenting voice.
Without making too many parallels with contemporary events, I suppose I'm interested, in the context of Ireland, do you think there is sufficient dissent from the dominant view on sort of international relations currently in the country? Do you think our national conversation is sufficiently fertile for that, for reasonable voices and reasonable opinions to come out?
No, I would be worried. Just take the latest debate about the triple lock. The Security Council just a week ago passed a resolution calling for a ceasefire in Ukraine and work towards a lasting peace. So this could have been interpreted as a moment at which the Security Council actually worked, whereas in fact we're arguing, it seems, that we can't keep the triple lock because the Security Council doesn't work. And then we have the whole question of sovereignty. And the European Union is about shared sovereignty, and the Commission would like more of a leadership role. There's this move towards massive military expenditure. So when you go into that room as Ireland, as a small country, with a view that's somewhat skeptical about solving problems through military means, I'm not sure we're going to get a great hearing. I'm not sure that it will be a great opportunity to express sovereignty. So I would have thought that at this moment, the triple lock would be quite an important protection. So we could say, we have our own view and we're not going to be drawn into this. It's really often, in my experience, it's a form of crowd behavior led by the most powerful actors. So I don't understand how the argument about sovereignty is being used. And then, of course, if this is a really important matter, the opposition ought to be consulted. There are many people living in this jurisdiction who either didn't vote in the last election or who wish we had a different government. And I don't think it's an appropriate exercise of democracy to close down a very important debate of this kind. Now, I think the government is leaving itself some room for manoeuvre, because what happens, I suppose, at cabinet level will open the door to a debate in the Dáil. And I think also there are many ways of finessing our present arrangements and creating more flexibility for ourselves within the present arrangements. So there is scope for a debate going forward, but I very much hope that debate will take place.
Thank you. Just to move on to your own career a little bit, can you offer a little background to your diplomatic experience, particularly in the area of negotiating peace agreements?
Well, at the time in my various postings, I often wondered what I was doing there and why I was sent to those particular venues. But as I look back, I consider myself extremely lucky that I spent many years in Brussels working within the EU institutions, many years in the UN in Geneva, and sometime in New York, also at the UN. I was at the Law of the Sea conference, and maybe above all, I spent many, many years in the so-called Helsinki process, which brought an end to the Cold War, and then in the OSCE, which is the continuation of that process after the end of the Cold War. So I have all these different experiences of diplomatic negotiations, but in particular, I spent 5 years working on the Good Friday Agreement. So I think I've come to see very much the difference between a well-conceived negotiation, which is changing something, and a less well-conceived, more bureaucratic way of approaching problems under which we don't seem to make very much progress. And then, of course, I should add that because of my involvement in the Good Friday Agreement, I was subsequently involved in a number of initiatives to bring lessons from the agreement to other spaces. So there was a joint British-Irish initiative when Brian Cowan was our foreign minister, which I was asked to lead, bringing the Good Friday Agreement to Jammu and Kashmir and the relations between India and Pakistan. Then John Hume went to Sri Lanka to mediate, and he asked the Department of Foreign Affairs that I should accompany him, which I did. I was involved after I retired in discussions in Korea and in the Palestinian territories. And more recently, the Catholic bishops of the European Union asked me to make a presentation about the war in Ukraine. So actually, I've spent many, many hours over many, many years trying to interpret the Good Friday Agreement for other audiences.
And what do you think the Good Friday Agreement could teach us in terms of resolving the conflict between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, this is something that could be looked at many different levels. What you do now, what you do in the future, how you structure the negotiations, and so on. But I think the most important learning for me is about the need to reframe a problem so that the possibility emerges that all sides can have a better future. So in the case of the Good Friday Agreement, we started with a binary question whether Northern Ireland was Irish or British. And thanks to many great diplomats and political figures, we were able to reframe the problem in such a way that we saw it as a matter of different relationships. And the amazing truth is that all these relationships are capable of benefiting from the agreement that we defined. So this could be between nationalists and unionists. It could be between Ireland and Britain. It could be, of course, on the island of Ireland. It could be at a European level. So it's worth asking ourselves how we got to that point of reframing the problem so that it was win-win-win for everyone. That's the key lesson. But then, of course, there are many other lessons. How were the negotiations structured? There were many strands. There was international mediation. And there was also the question of putting ideas out there in advance of the end to the violence. The Downing Street Declaration came before the paramilitary cessations of violence. The framework document, I'm just doing this very quickly, but the framework document came before the negotiations in 1998. And then I think at a very deep level, I think we have to listen to Seamus Heaney here, that there's something that's given about a breakthrough of this kind. You persist, you work hard, you build the relationships, but at some point, what is it that Seamus says? The cloudburst, whose boat will lift when the cloudburst happens. There's something that happens which is not in our control, and that's, I think, for Seamus, that's where poetry and politics are similar. You act with integrity, you work hard, but the really good thing that happens is something that occurs maybe not quite when you expect it.
Yeah. I suppose the Northern Irish peace dialogue was conducted for the most part, in a kind of, well, not a very, but quite a formal diplomatic way. There's certainly the Irish government weren't coming out with statements about this and that that were contradicted by other people, or, you know, and the British and the Irish were tended to be on the same page, and tended to, you know, there seemed to be relations had developed over a long period of, you know, going back to the Good Friday Agreement. And whereas today we find a different spectacle of, you know, these of negotiations almost occurring on live TV, you know, with Trump welcoming Macron, Starmer, Zelensky, and you know, you might say it's a very democratic approach to negotiation, because the you know, the American people and the wider world are given a sort of fireside seat. But do you think that is very problematic? Do you think that will prove it will make things much more difficult now because of what was said, you know, in public meetings, in front of the press gallery, in front of the cameras? Is that now going to be an impediment to moving forward?
I think that these constant statements on X, small potted statements from many different actors, are a huge impediment to diplomacy. I mean, the contrast with the functioning negotiations that I took part in could not be greater. In the years 1984 to 1986, I took part in the Stockholm Conference, which was the major military conference of the old CSCE. And that took the form of numerous 8-week sessions over 3 years with gaps in between. And there was a very gradual sifting of ideas. You know, you first of all had everyone make any proposal they wanted, and then you tried to identify major themes, and then you identified how they could be grouped into different working groups. Then you appointed facilitators, someone to hold the pen who played the role of an independent mediator. And all of this was supported by any amount of what were called corridor conversations. There were informal meetings. There could be high-level meetings back in the capital. So it was an immense project of interpersonal engagement with a great effort made to accommodate one another. Now, there were similarities between that and the Good Friday Agreement process, because so much time was invested over so many years in our peace process, and so many relationships came into being. As Seamus Mallon said to me once, more and more people came onto the dance floor. So I think the answer to your question is yes. I think this trading of simple ideas before a vast audience is a disaster. I mean, it's part of a wider cultural disaster that we're experiencing with the use of technology. You know, what we call the information environment is compromised in many different ways.
And what advice would you have for the Taoiseach if he's to be accommodated by the US president?
Now, I wasn't thinking about that in advance of this conversation. Now, if the Taoiseach would
question did strike me.
If the Taoiseach would like to ask me that question, he did actually launch our centre a few years ago. I'd be delighted to think about it. So, how would I answer that question?
Well, perhaps your answer is that you would advise him behind closed doors.
No. Well, also, I think I would say, don't forget the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. People don't seem to know that organization meets weekly at ambassador level in Vienna, in the presence of the European Union countries, Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and all the other participating states. And the OSCE is extremely flexible. It can have meetings of military advisors or small group meetings or ministerial meetings. It can commission academic studies. So we have here a framework that already exists and which includes the United States, of course, and which has expertise in various forms of confidence building and ceasefire monitoring. So there's a lore available there. And above all, because of the matrix of principles, as they're called, which are the foundation of the OSCE, it has the capacity to be the host to a very valuable dialogue through time, so that instead of looking for some kind of transactional end to this war, some kind of institutionalized standoff along a line of contact, the OSCE can provide a framework for détente, as it was called in the Cold War period, or for rapprochement was another word that was used. Unfortunately, because the decline of the OSCE is closely associated in people's minds with the collapse in relations with the Russian Federation, it has got the name for being ineffective. But an organization can only be as effective as the participating states. And in this particular case, Ireland has a very valuable track record. When Eamon Gilmore was the foreign minister, he launched a review of the OSCE, which was an attempt to push relationships on the continent of Europe back on track. And that's what I was involved in when I was sent to Vienna as ambassador. So I think my on-screen answer to your question is remember the OSCE, and I'm available for detailed explanations.
I suppose it strikes me that, Ireland, as a neutral country, historically might have some parallels with sort of the Republican view in the United States, the isolationist view, to not get involved in wars and to not align. I mean, Ireland has had a long history of being part of the non-aligned movement, didn't it? And so perhaps our neutrality is an advantage as we negotiate with the White House. Is that possible?
I'm not sure whether we really could have called ourselves members of the non-aligned movement. But I think what was true was our independence was intended to be of value to others, to India and to Egypt. And we were definitely part of a very important movement during the 20th century, which was the emancipation of the rest of the world from Eurocentric values. That is a very valuable heritage. And there, I'm sure we have something in common with the United States. So I think I would agree with you insofar as you say we should emphasize our relationship, our friendship with the United States, the personal ties, the way we understand one another.
Just as Irish ambassador to Russia, no doubt you conducted high-level negotiations with Kremlin officials. Were these trusty interlocutors, I wonder? Should we be pursuing negotiations now with Russia, given that this may be interpreted by them as a reward for aggression?
Well, maybe I look at that second point first. I think anyone going into negotiations in a situation of terrible conflict and even of horror in many ways will have those thoughts. How is it felt, when Israel and Hamas are negotiating with one another? Or I'm not saying that these are parallels at all, but they're vague analogies. What about how white South Africans felt when they negotiated with the African National Congress? For a long time, they thought that they were illegitimizing terrorists, which I don't think anyone would nowadays use as the lens through which to understand the end of apartheid. I think every negotiation to end a war involves a risk for peace. And you can mitigate that risk in all kinds of ways. You can have talks about talks. You can have parameters for the negotiations, such as we had with the Mitchell Principles in Northern Ireland. When I was involved in the peace process here, I was at the first meeting which Irish officials had with Tony Blair after he became leader of the Labour Party. And he volunteered without any prompting the statement, "We must not demonize Gerry Adams." So I acknowledge the feelings that you refer to, but when would there ever be a peace process if those feelings were to be decisive? And speaking as a Christian, I would say, Jesus tells us to love our enemies. And in fact, there's a very interesting passage in the New Testament about peace negotiations. It's in St. Luke, where Jesus describes two kings marching against each other with armies, and they're uncertain of what's going to happen. And so he urges them to talk the business of peace. So I think we have to take the risk of peace. There's no easy way of avoiding that. Now, as regards the interlocutors in Russia, of course, the Russian foreign ministry must be one of the most qualified in the world. And they're very, very capable. They have tremendous... I found the diplomats I was dealing with would have tremendous background knowledge of the history of Europe, for example, probably more than the diplomats from other countries. So I don't think there's any difficulty in finding people in Russia with whom to talk. Now, you're right, we did have high-level discussions in my time. We had the visit of President McAleese. It's the only time we've ever had a visit at that level. And we also had a visit by the foreign minister and other high-level visits. And I was encouraged, by the quality of the discussions. Also, Mikhail Gorbachev said to me at one meeting that his dream was that Ireland could reconcile Moscow and Washington. So Mikhail Gorbachev said that to me in 2010. It's precisely because of our friendship with the Americans, and on the other hand, what he thought was our empathy, where we might be able to understand a Russian perspective better than many others.
That's fascinating. So we're dealing with a very sophisticated diplomatic cadre and a society that is, I suppose, more probably cosmopolitan and cultured than we often give it credit for. Just following on from that question, Philip, do you think there would be some reticence on the Russian side to negotiate with the Europeans or Americans?
I think there are fears on their side. I think as Moscow would see it, the economic sanctions that have been imposed are intended essentially to bring about a collapse of the Russian economy. And they also, I think, have a suspicion that this enormous investment in drone technology is intended by some Western countries to change the situation in the actual fighting in the direction of a victory, quote unquote, for Ukraine. And of course, finally, they would see a pattern of discrediting or criminalizing the Russian leadership precisely in order to prevent negotiations. So Ukraine passed a decree forbidding negotiations with President Putin. So the Russian fear would be that countries like Britain in particular are essentially looking for regime change. Now, I noticed that that's not in the recent presentations by Keir Starmer, so that may be wrong. But if we're talking about fears on one side or another, I think we have to recognize that the Russians also have fears.
What you are listening to has taken time and resources to prepare. It is a collaboration of committed journalists. Please, if you can, share, subscribe, or support this podcast in whatever way you can. The level of, I suppose we might call it vitriol, that we hear in the British press and from their politicians towards Russia, it's sometimes quite shocking, it seems to me. Does this go back to the 19th century? Is there? How are we to explain the British reaction to Russia?
Well, that probably deserves a whole study in itself. One doesn't like to go into such painful topics, but I think we have to remember the role of the British after the Russian Revolution or after the overthrow of the Tsar. The British were heavily involved in the civil war in Russia, and that involved, using diplomatic channels to practice bribery and subversion. And it also involved exploring the use of hunger as a weapon. And I suppose from the Russian point of view, that was on a par with the kind of involvement that the British at that time had in many other geographies. And then, of course, there's the history of the Second World War, where the Russians feel that they're 27 million dead in the war, or the 27 million dead among Soviet citizens, has been somewhat removed from the historical memory. And then maybe after Brexit, the only way in which Britain can seem to be at the heart of what's happening in Western Europe is through the geopolitical sphere. And so, well, all those factors are capable of causing suspicion.
And this, I suppose, leads into another question of whether we should consider, is Russia a European country? Is it part of European civilization, or is it something else? Is it Asiatic? I realize those terms are unsatisfactory, but there, we do conceive of something we call Europe. And do you see Russia as being part of that culturally?
I think Russia is part of it, yes. We usually say that Europe extends to the Ural Mountains. So Russia has, of course, a huge territory beyond the Urals as well. But European Russia is definitely part of Europe. The whole of the post-war Helsinki process was premised on that. But quite apart from that, you just have to look at literature and culture. You have to look at Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Pushkin. The fact that that Russia has a very strong Christian tradition. It also has a Muslim tradition. I suppose that Kazan is one of the most important Muslim centers in all of Europe.
Just to tease that out further, does any peace process have to acknowledge that or build on that? Or are we looking, at a kind of a new Cold War similar to what we've seen?
I think we have to recognize that there has been a cancellation of Russian culture in parts of Eastern Europe, and contrast that with how we have handled our own situation. It could be argued that Irish independence involved the breakup of the United Kingdom, which saw itself as a very important political entity. And we were conscious of this. And so we've always worked towards a solution in Northern Ireland where you can be Irish or British or both. We have compromised very gladly on many issues over the last century. We've kept open, access to health services, the right to vote, all kinds of other privileged relationships between Ireland and Britain. Before we joined the EU, Irish people could work in Britain when we couldn't work in other parts of Europe. So we've never tried to cancel those human links. In the peace process, I went with Bertie Ahern. It was a great privilege to 2 meetings with Tony Blair at football matches, one in Glasgow and one in Newcastle. It was Newcastle United against Manchester United. And Bobby Charlton was at the table. And when Bertie and Tony Blair went off in a corner to speak, the chairman of Newcastle said, "This is the most important meeting we've hosted here since we signed Alan Shearer." So you had here a real cultural warmth, which was preserved in the middle of everything. Now contrast that with what's happened in many parts of Eastern Europe, not just Ukraine, but at the end of the Cold War, these processes of vetting of public officials, to make sure they had no trace of Russian or communist leanings. It's, to me, I'm afraid, I'm not an expert on this, but I would start by asking, is this not a bit like McCarthyism in the United States? So I think an end to the cancellation of Russian culture is definitely part of any peace process.
Does the change of administration in the United States offer opportunities for ending the conflict between Russia and Ukraine on terms that are broadly fair to both parties?
Well, I suppose the Security Council resolution of a week ago speaks for itself. That does seem to be something new. Now, in terms of how to make sure that what happens is good for all sides, that's the big task of diplomacy now. And I think that question has to be answered with reference to specifics. We have to go back to some of the factors that are at the root of the differences, and we also have to look at some of the factors that could bring us together in future. In 1997, as I recall, George Kennan, Henry Kissinger, Paul Nitze, and a whole range of leading American experts on the Cold War, they appealed to the US government not to expand NATO in the way in which it was going to expand. So there is that awareness in parts of the US leadership that there's a history here behind the whole conflict. So it's not to say, I'm not trying to say whether it was right or wrong to associate the enlargement of the European Union with the enlargement of NATO, but I'm saying that there is a very easily understood perception on the Russian side that was unnecessary, especially in view of what they consider to be the undertakings that were made at the end of the Cold War. And then in that general picture, the decision to offer NATO membership to Ukraine and Georgia was seen as an extreme development of a policy that was already unfair from their point of view. So I would say that the main part of the answer to your question really has to come down to looking at a handful of very specific issues, all of which can be correlated with the Helsinki principles, which I mentioned earlier, and therefore all of which are capable of being addressed within the OSCE framework. They could be addressed elsewhere as well, but the OSCE is a possible framework.
I'm sorry, just to go back a little bit further, can you just maybe for our listeners just trace the origins of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine as you've seen it? In order to, I suppose, to advance, we have to have a clear historical understanding.
I think it's impossible to give a completely definitive account of these things, but I think what's important to recognize is that there's complexity. So I did speak earlier about Thucydides, and I don't think he's ever been bettered as an analyst of historical causation. So Thucydides looks at the Peloponnesian War, that disastrous war, and certainly it was begun by Sparta. But Thucydides then shows that there was a history over the previous few years in which Athens refused to litigate on some of the subjects that were of concern to Sparta. Then there was a history going back 50 years, the period between the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian War. And then Thucydides even takes a 400-year perspective. So he tries to show that there are different dynamics, long-term, medium-term, short-term, and these dynamics then, they connect with human frailty, especially with human anger. You know, the Greeks were really interested in anger as the opposite of deliberation. And so mistakes are made. But to try to explain a conflict just in terms of one person's failing or worse is inadequate. Roger Casement, this is just something I've been looking into, but Roger Casement wrote an article in September 1914 about the origins of the First World War. And he's making the same point, that there was a very strong move to say that the war that had just begun was a result of Germany's aggression against Belgium. And Roger Casement says, well, that's obviously extremely relevant, but there's also a history, especially the history of the colonial empires and a failure of self-awareness among those empires as to how they were heading to conflict rather than addressing a more important question for humanity at the time. So complexity is the point. Now, to try to break that down, I think there are just a handful of things that have to be considered. And one of them is how the Cold War ended and the principle of the territorial integrity of states. So at the time of the Cold War, the principle of the territorial integrity of states protected the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. But in the very fast-moving situation, we decided, I mean the European community, to recognize all the parts of Yugoslavia and all the parts of the Soviet Union as new states, but without bringing the other Helsinki principles into play, without creating guardrails or assurances. And so I think now we have to go back and say, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of relationship between Ukraine and Russia and Ukraine and Germany for example, was expected in 1991 at the end of the Cold War. I think nowadays everyone, I think, would recognize that we made a mess of Bosnia, but I think we also made a mess of Ukraine at that time. And from a Russian point of view, what you have is a Western world trying to suggest that there is a radical difference, almost, well, we say civilizational difference, but we say civilizational, maybe others hear something worse, between Ukraine and Russia, and that we're turning Ukraine into a sort of, well, they use the word anti-Russia. It's as if Ireland, having become independent of the United Kingdom, was to be set up by external actors as an existential rival to England, which we never, ever dreamt of doing. So the first thing is to look at the circumstances at the end of the Cold War. The second thing to look at is about the way we legitimized NATO as a security provider, quote unquote, at the expense of the UN and the CSCE. So there was a very strong move led by the Americans in the 1990s to suggest that all of these institutions are interlocking, and there's no basic difference between a military alliance on the one hand and a regional security organization under the UN Charter on the other hand. So this paves the way for the idea that we in Europe and the United States are a source of legitimacy equal to or greater than the UN. That mistake is going to haunt us for a long time unless we recognize it. It's not going to play in the global south, that concept. So the second thing is this whole concept of a military alliance as being a source of legitimacy in itself. And I think the third thing is about economic cooperation, because under the old CSCE and those principles still apply. Economic cooperation is a core principle, and that's economic cooperation with everyone on all issues. And I'm sorry to say we have resiled from that. I mean, we have the sanctions at the moment, but even before that, we created a mode of interaction in the European continent in which we had a hub, which was Brussels and the Commission, and then spokes. And we didn't want to discuss any of the strategic issues of the economy, energy, environment, and so on in a multilateral context. And I think a final core issue is how we understand human rights, because we, in the context of relations with the countries east of Vienna, we focused over many years on issues to do with, same-sex marriage and other new emerging issues, which are fine. So I spoke in favor of same-sex marriage myself in the OSCE, but the point we have to recognize is that there's nothing about that in the Helsinki Final Act or in the commitments which all these countries have taken on together. And at the same time as bringing in our new agenda, we basically abandoned the whole agenda of economic and social rights, and the questions of housing and shelter and healthcare and so on. So we created a narrow human rights debate on topics which were not actually in the original documents at all. So we tried basically to reinvent the nature of dialogue in the European space. And I think we have to go back and ask ourselves, was all of that worth it? And are we right? And especially now, we have a wider world. We have to ask ourselves, what would China say, or what would India say? What would Brazil say? What would Africa say? From an African point of view, the key issue is hunger. One only has to look at the comprehensive statistics coming out of the UN from the Food and Agriculture Organization and other bodies. 20% of the population of Africa face what they call acute food insecurity. But in some countries, it's 40%. Now, our center has a project on the ground in Malawi, and we find that households often simply don't eat on some days of each month, and that the amount of money which would enable them to eat might be less than €1. So in a world in which people are going hungry for less than €1, we in the European Union are talking of spending countless billions on weapons, which, if we had a peace process with Russia, would be redundant in any case. So there's a loss of proportionality, in the name of defending what we consider, what we call the foundations of our civilization. We're presenting the rest of the world with arguments which they will find not persuasive.
I suppose that was anticipated my next question, which was around the recent decisions to increase military expenditure in the UK and talk of more investment in Ireland and France and across the continent, and increasing the share of our GDP that we spend on defence contracts. I mean, I assume, that we should maintain some military presence, or that European countries have to, defend themselves. Yes. And there is a certain logic to Ireland, certainly perhaps investing in maritime defences and maintaining its sovereignty, I suppose. But the sums being talked about seem extraordinary in the global context. And I suppose where we seem to be in a new sort of paradigm here, a new Cold War seems to be on the horizon. And, how are we going to prevent that from, how are we going to prevent the war in Ukraine metastasizing into a sort of permanent conflict that there may not be carnage on the front, but our energies and our will be dissipated from trying to achieve social objectives in our own country and around the world. How are we going to dampen the flames?
Yes, well, doesn't it have to be through negotiations of one kind or another? So we need a methodology or a framework to think about the future. I suppose our culture is now in a phase, both at home and internationally, where we're not thinking about the future. And our centre is promoting a number of initiatives as best we can about the future as a political idea, which is a quote from a professor in LSE. We have some obvious starting points, such as the SDGs and the climate change commitments, and a growing awareness of the way that technology is changing our world. But we need to bring into this discussion some kind of high-level sense of what is true or what is right and wrong in the world. I mean, this is Aristotle again, but you need to have a world view, and then you need to look at the particular decisions you face, and the worldview will influence the decisions, and the decisions will influence the worldview. So there's a dialogical relationship. But that dialogical relationship between high-level values and day-to-day decisions does not seem to be understood. So we need, I think, new spaces. They could be even small spaces led by civil society, where we have discussions of that kind. That's how the Cold War came to an end. It was through that kind of reflection. And George Kennan in particular said that, the only form of security in the long run depends on the habits and assumptions of people.
So this is the role for civil society in all countries, that we engage with the political process and consider world affairs, and from the local to the global. And but it seems to me we have a difficulty today actually finding the right information. Even we've sort of, I think the coverage, perhaps you'll agree, of the Ukrainian war it is so one-sided. It's almost absurd in many of our countries, and it's not that any of us are justifying what the Russians have done, but it just seems that we're not having an adequate debate on what's happening. It's as if they, I suppose, the political class are in collaboration with the media class, and we're not getting adequate coverage. Are there better sources that we can look at? What would you advise in that regard?
Well, I'd have to do some thinking to come up with a list of sources, but I think the principle of being informed is very important. And I think that governments have an obligation to enable the kinds of dialogue that I'm talking about. Every government has a policy planning capability, which is about looking into the future. And those discussions could be open to a wider group. In the European Union, we have Article 17 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which provides for a structured dialogue with churches, faith communities, and philosophical organizations. So that could be used. Or when it comes to revising the development agenda, when the SDGs come to the endpoint in 2030, we can make sure that civil society is heard. That's happening, I think, in the climate change negotiations. There is a space for civil society. But basically, governments have an interest in thinking about the future in a way which brings people into politics and restores the faith of young people in the purposes of politics. This is the big challenge of our time. And I think the issue with Ukraine is, can we use the end of the war in Ukraine to have a new beginning, based on a serious agenda across a number of issues? I could suggest some very basic things. One would be, will the Russian Federation recognize the European Union as a key part of the political architecture of Europe? Because the OSCE, CSCE is still based on the idea of individual states. Now, when I was involved in the review of the OSCE, one of the issues that I was trying to look into was whether the Russians would recognize the EU in return for the EU being more flexible in how we engage with countries on the borders of Russia, so that it's not a zero-sum game, that they're either with the EU or with Russia. Now, this seems to be possible now more than ever before, because there's new thinking coming, I think, from Enrico Letta and others, that to be affiliated to the European Union has different elements. It can be the single market or the customs union, or it can be agriculture, free movement of people, budgets. So countries as different as Turkey, UK, Balkans, Ukraine, for the foreseeable future, they're all likely to have a custom-made form of interaction with the EU. So in that context, we don't have to present countries like Georgia, Armenia, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova with a binary choice, but we can try to take a civilizational view, if you like, of Europe as a space where the European Union is key, but it's not the totality of what Europe means. So that's a whole agenda in itself. And one could probably then insist on connecting this revival of European diplomacy with some kind of global vision, which is extremely urgent. We talk about the amount of money which is spent on weapons, which is shocking and completely out of proportion. But we also need to focus on what these weapons actually mean in practice. Most of humanity considers that nuclear weapons are not legitimate. The cyber weapons, that involves giving ourselves the capability in advance to bring down the whole infrastructure of other countries. Is that legitimate? The whole use of lethal autonomous weapons, as we've seen pioneered in Gaza, is that legitimate? There's a very serious agenda there. I mean, when I read that the British government wants to produce missiles in Belfast, it makes me wonder about what's going on there, because the whole point about missiles is the more you use, the more money somebody is going to make. When I was visiting the line of contact in Ukraine some years ago, lots of people said the reason that there's so many missiles flying back and forth is because a lot of money is being made on the missiles. They cost so much. And I see even in today's Financial Times an article saying that all this investment in weapons may be very good for the British economy, because look at how Israel has developed a modern, innovative industry on the basis of its military production. I read another article a few days ago in the Financial Times saying that all of this money being spent on military equipment is very good for the economy because Britain is such a strong exporter. And one of the companies was mentioned as exporting £1.4 billion per year. So are we actually going for all these weapons in order to make money or for reasons of self-defense? So there's a need for a much more morally serious form of multilateralism in the coming years. It's at this stage, it's a planetary emergency. And to say this is to be realistic, not idealistic. It's just to read the writing on the wall.
I think on that slightly scary note, but I think a strong idea to finish on. I think that's a good moment to finish.
And I think another quote.
Sure,
it
yeah.
Just came, but Dietrich Bonhoeffer in 1943 said we must have the courage to believe in a future that is not visible in the alternatives of the present. So that's the future that we have to enable by our political choices.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Cassandra Voices is a multimedia project that seeks to highlight independent voices and inspire original thinking with stories from Ireland and around the world. Go to CassandraVoices.com online to read more and look out for more episodes from us in future. Your attention and your support are crucial. Thank you.